The sound was the first thing to violate the sanctuary of the cabin, a noise so rhythmically repulsive that it seemed to lower the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. Leo, a sound engineer who had retreated to the isolated coastal town of Oak Haven to finish the audio mix for an indie thriller, sat frozen in his makeshift studio. He had been scrubbing through a field recording of the shoreline he had taken earlier that afternoon, just ambient wind, the cry of gulls, and the crash of waves against the jagged cliffs. But upon playback layered beneath the white noise of the ocean, there was something else. It was a wet, heavy sound, like a soaked heavy coat being slapped against concrete, followed by a sickening, breathless wheeze. Slap, wheeze, slap, wheeze. It was too loud to be background noise, yet Leo was certain the beach had been empty. He isolated the frequency, boosting the gain, and the room filled with the magnified sound of wet footsteps pacing just behind where he had been standing. The footsteps didn't crunch on the gravel. They sounded like dead weight hitting the earth with terrible purpose. Leo pulled the headphones off, his heart hammering against his ribs, and looked out the oversized bay window that overlooked the gray, churning Atlantic. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the dunes. The isolation of the cabin, which had been a selling point on the rental listing, suddenly felt like a cage. He tried to rationalize the audio, perhaps a loose flap of windbreaker hitting the microphone, or a peculiar interference from the radio tower miles away. Needing fresh air to clear the rising static in his head, he grabbed his coat and stepped out onto the port. The air smelled of salt and decaying kelp, thick and heavy with the oncoming fog. He looked down toward the beach, 100 yards below the cliff edge. The tide was unusually low, revealing a landscape of black rocks and tidal pools that usually remained hidden. That was when he saw it. Far out on the wet sand, near the edge of the receding water, a figure stood motionless. The distance made it difficult to gauge scale, but something was wrong with the proportions. The figure was impossibly tall, thin as a reed, and pale against the darkening water. It looked like a piece of bleached driftwood standing upright. Leo squinted, leaning over the railing. The figure was not facing the ocean. It was facing the cliff, facing the cabin. Then it moved. It didn't walk so much as it lurched, its legs appearing to possess too many joints, snapping forward in a fluid, unnatural motion. Even from this distance, Leo's ears, trained to pick up the slightest nuance, hallucinated the sound he had heard on the tape. Slap, wheeze. The figure covered 20 feet in a single stride. Panic, cold and primal, seized Leo. He retreated inside, locking the heavy deadbolt, and drew the curtains, his hands trembling. The next morning, the unease had not dissipated. The fog had rolled in thick, turning the world outside into a wall of white vapor. Leo drove into the small town of Oak Haven, needing human contact and perhaps a logical explanation for the strange figure on the flats. He stopped at a weathered diner near the docks, the kind of place that smelled of fried fish and old coffee. He struck up a conversation with the waitress, a stern-faced woman in her 60s named Martha, and casually mentioned the tall person he'd seen on the beach. He expected a chuckle about a local eccentric or a confused shrug. Instead, the diner went silent. The only other patron, an old fisherman nursing a mug of tea in the corner, set his cup down with a clatter. Martha stopped wiping the counter, the rag freezing in her hand. She looked at Leo, her eyes searching his face for any sign of a joke. Finding none, her expression hardened into something resembling pity. "Did you hear it?" the old fisherman asked from the corner, his voice like grinding gravel. "Before you saw it, did you hear the wet slap?" Leo felt the blood drain from his face. He nodded slowly. The fisherman stood up, his movements stiff, and walked over to Leo's booth. "That wasn't a person, son. You saw the hollow treader. The locals don't say the name much anymore, mostly because we pray it's forgotten us. It rides the king tide looking for vessels." Leo tried to laugh it off, asking if this was a tourist scare tactic, but the fisherman leaned in close. He smelled of brine and fear. "It doesn't want your boat. It wants your skin to wear. It abducts those it marks, drags them down to the crushing depths, and leaves them hollow. If it looked at you, if it walked toward you, you have until the tide comes back in tonight." Martha ushered Leo out shortly after, but not before pressing a small bag of dried sage and a handful of iron nails into his palm. "Iron on the threshold," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And heat. It hates the dry heat. Crank your stove. Do not let the damp in. And whatever you do, do not open the door, no matter who you think is asking." Leo drove back to the cabin, his mind oscillating between skepticism and a deep ancestral terror. The logical part of his brain screamed that this was rural superstition, a hazing ritual for the city boy, but the memory of that lurching, multi-jointed stride on the beach was etched into his retinas. The audio file was real. The fear in the old man's eyes was real. As he pulled into the driveway, the fog was so dense he could barely see the outline of the cabin. The silence of the coast was absolute, suffocating. He spent the afternoon turning the cabin into a fortress. He locked every window, drew every blind, and feeling foolish yet desperate, placed the iron nails along the threshold of the front and back doors. He cranked the thermostat to 80 degrees and built a roaring fire in the wood stove, feeding it log after log until the air in the cabin was parched and stifling. He set up his audio equipment in the living room, monitoring the exterior microphones he had left mounted on the porch, treating them like a perimeter alarm. As night fell, the fog pressed against the glass like a physical weight. The ocean was invisible, but he could hear the tide returning. It sounded angry, the waves crashing with a violence that shook the floorboards. At 10:14 p.m., the meters on his mixing board spiked. The sound was coming from the porch. Slap, wheeze. It was louder now, heavier. Leo put on his headphones, paralyzed. The sound circled the house. It wasn't just footsteps. It was the sound of something wet and heavy dragging itself along the wooden siding of the cabin. He heard the distinct groan of the porch railing being tested, stressed under immense weight. Then, silence. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire and the thumping of his own heart. Then came a knock. It was a polite, rhythmic rapping on the heavy oak door. "Leo." The voice was muffled but unmistakable. It was Sarah, his fiancée. "Leo, open up. My flight got diverted to the regional airport. I rented a car. It's freezing out here." Leo's hand flew to his mouth. Sarah was supposed to be in Chicago. She wasn't visiting until next week, but the voice, the cadence, the slight pitch drop at the end of her sentence, it was perfect. "Leo, please, I dropped my keys in the sand. I can't find them. Let me in." He stood up, taking a step toward the door. It made sense. Flights got diverted all the time. She would have surprised him. He reached for the deadbolt, his hand hovering inches from the metal. "Leo, why is it so hot in there? I can see the fire through the window." The voice shifted slightly. It sounded impatient, but underneath the impatience was a strange, gurgling undertone, like water bubbling in a drain. Leo froze. He looked down at the threshold where he had placed the iron nails. A dark, viscous liquid was seeping under the door frame, pooling around the iron. The nails were hissing, corroding rapidly, turning into piles of rust within seconds. The liquid wasn't rain. It smelled of deep, stagnant ocean water and sulfur. "Open the door, Leo," the voice commanded, losing the facade of Sarah. It was now a mimicry of his own voice, distorted and overlaid with the sound of crushing waves. "I am so." "Dry," Leo scrambled back, grabbing the poker from the fireplace. "Go away," he screamed, his voice cracking. The response was a physical blow to the house. The entire cabin shuddered as something massive slammed against the door. The wood splintered but held. Slap, wheeze. The sound was now coming from the roof. Dust drifted down from the ceiling beams. It was climbing. Leo realized with horror that the chimney was the only opening he hadn't sealed. He grabbed a bottle of lighter fluid and doused the fire, sending a roar of flames up the flue just as a pale, translucent hand, long and boneless, began to extrude itself from the fireplace opening. The limb recoiled with a shriek that sounded like tearing metal, retreating up the chimney as the fire surged. The siege lasted for hours. The entity tested every window, every vent. Leo huddled in the center of the living room, sweating in the oppressive heat, clutching the fire poker. The voices outside cycled through everyone he knew, his mother, his brother, his boss, all begging to be let in, all eventually dissolving into that wet, wheezing laughter. The moisture in the room began to rise despite the fire. The wallpaper started to peel, the books on the shelves warped. The hollow treader wasn't just outside, its presence was saturating the reality inside the cabin. Leo closed his eyes, humming loudly to drown out the cacophony of voices, feeding the fire until the furniture began to smoke from the ambient heat. He was fighting a war of attrition against the ocean itself. Just before dawn, the sounds ceased abruptly. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, leaving a vacuum of silence. Leo waited, his muscles locked in a spasm of tension, watching the sunrise paint the curtains with a pale gray light. He checked his watch, 7 a.m., low tide. He waited another hour, then 2, before summoning the courage to move. He approached the front door. The puddle of dark water had evaporated, leaving a stain of salt crystals on the hardwood. He unlocked the deadbolt and threw the door open. The porch was empty. The fog had lifted, revealing a bright, crisp morning. The only evidence of the night's terror was the porch railing, which had been crushed as if squeezed by a giant hand, and a trail of slime leading off the deck and back toward the dunes. Leo didn't pack. He grabbed his keys, his wallet, and the hard drive with the recording, and sprinted to his car. He drove until the ocean was a distant memory, until the smell of salt was replaced by the exhaust fumes of the interstate. He didn't stop until he was 3 states away, in a motel in the middle of a landlocked arid plain. He called Sarah, weeping when she answered, confirming she was safe in Chicago, having never left her apartment. He told her everything. She listened, concerned, suggesting exhaustion and carbon monoxide poisoning from the wood stove. Leo wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe it was a hallucination born of isolation and infrasound. 3 years passed. Leo moved to Arizona, as far from the coast as he could get. He avoided swimming pools, baths, and even rainstorms. He eventually found a semblance of peace, though he never worked in sound engineering again. Silence was safer than listening to what might be hidden in the noise. One evening, while sitting on his patio watching the dry heat lightning flash across the desert sky, a sudden freak torrential downpour began. It was a monsoon burst, rare and violent. The water hit the parched earth with a deafening roar. Leo stood up to go inside, a familiar anxiety tightening his chest. As he reached for the sliding glass door, he paused. The rain was loud, drumming against the roof, but underneath the thunder and the splatter, he heard it. Faint but undeniable, slap, wheeze. It was coming from the gutter above his head. He froze, his hand trembling on the glass. He looked down at his feet. Seeping under the door track, defying the slope of the patio, was a trickle of dark, briny water. It smelled of kelp and deep-sea rot. "Leo," a voice whispered from the darkness of the yard, mimicking the exact tone of his own internal monologue. "You forgot. The tide comes in everywhere." A flash of lightning illuminated the cacti in the yard. Standing amongst them, towering over the saguaros, was a pale, elongated figure, its skin like wet paper, grinning with a mouthful of needle-like teeth. It raised a hand that had far too many fingers and tapped on the glass. Click, click, click. Leo realized then that the desert hadn't saved him. He hadn't escaped. He had just delayed the drowning. The glass shattered inward, and the smell of the ocean flooded the room, drowning out the dry desert air forever.